Howard Hughes had it all. Rich, famous, and charming, he seemed like a man who could have anything he wanted. But behind all that success, his life was taking a dark turn. Then came the intense case of OCD, paranoia, and even depression. Something inside him was breaking, slowly pushing him into isolation. But why? Where did this all come from? Well, to find the answer, we have to go back to his childhood, where his mind was shaped in ways no one ever expected. You see, Howard Hughes grew up with a mother who was terrified of germs and sickness. She made him sleep in her room almost every night, thinking it was the only way to keep him safe. His father, on the other hand, wanted Howard to toughen up, so he sent him off to different boarding schools. But the opposite of his dad's wishes is what happened. These schools didn't exactly want a shy, partly deaf kid who wasn't interested in studying, so they tried several times to get him out and not accept his applications. But Howard's dad still wanted him to have a normal life at any cost, so he started giving out huge checks to them to change their minds. And how did they respond? With all smiles and open arms, welcoming young Howard. However, the school wasn't easy for Howard. He was quiet and had a hard time making friends. But he discovered two things he loved that didn't require talking to people: flying and movies. Little did he know these two things would make up his entire life and put his name in the history books. It was all because he was drawn to the excitement and adventure they offered, and both gave him an escape. Just when things seemed to be going well, something horrible happened. The one thing that would shape the rest of his life in both good and bad ways. The demise of both his parents. They passed within 2 years of each other. Now Howard was alone, with a ton of money from his inheritance, a fear of germs like his mother's, and no one to tell him what to do. On top of that, he wasn't well educated, but he was determined to make his mark. He was sure his money could help him break down any barriers, just like his father's drill bits. So he set out to take on Hollywood and the skies, two places where he could find all the thrill and glory he wanted without having to follow anyone's rules. Howard Hughes left Houston for Hollywood, where his uncle Rupert worked as a screenwriter. But as a teenager in Hollywood with all that cash as his inheritance, he quickly started burning through it. Just like that, he became a big spender. Too big. Instead of buying one pair of fancy shoes, he'd buy 20. And when it came to buying cars, one wasn't enough. Howard would take 6. But this was only the beginning. He bought watches by the tray and got himself fitted for 20 custom-made suits from Brooks Brothers in a single afternoon. Now, in retrospect, some would argue that all of these were not normal. There was something wrong with Howard that a lot of people didn't notice at the time. But we'll get to that. On the bright side, despite how wasteful he was, Howard did not forget his passions. Soon enough, he diverted some of his money to movies. But now his family began to raise their eyebrows at just how much he was spending. But he had a solution for that too. To keep his family quiet about his spending, he bought out their shares in Hughes Tool Co. and then poured $3.8 million, a huge amount back then, into making Hell's Angels, a World War I aerial combat film. It wasn't an easy road. Hughes went through 3 directors before deciding to direct it himself. But when it finally came out in 1930, it was a massive hit, both critically and commercially, and made a star of Jean Harlow, the original platinum blonde. Hughes was no longer the young Texan with big dreams. He was officially part of Hollywood's elite, with beautiful women vying for his attention. Sure, there were a lot more successes for our little wonder boy, but that did not remove anything from his struggles, the struggles he probably got from his childhood. A struggle that made everyone believe he had lost his mind. In truth, Howard was sick. Very sick. And not a lot of people knew about it. Howard Hughes's mental health took a serious nosedive over the years, and his OCD, paranoia, and later, depression, completely took over his life. His OCD was intense, pushing him to come up with elaborate routines to avoid any contact with germs. He even had a manual for his staff with wild instructions on the proper way to open a can of peaches, remove the label, scrub it, and handle it carefully to keep it germ-free. It didn't stop there. Hughes ordered his employees to follow strict procedures for everything, from washing hands with specific tissues to wrapping food in foil to avoid contamination. As his condition worsened, Hughes isolated himself almost entirely, staying holed up in dark hotel rooms where he stopped bathing, changing clothes, and even cut himself off from his own employees and friends. He wrapped his feet in Kleenex boxes instead of wearing shoes to avoid dirty surfaces, and demanded multiple tissues to open cabinets and doors. But this is where the story takes an even darker turn. Remember how Hughes loved aviation and flying planes? Well, he was test flying an experimental XF-11 reconnaissance plane for the Army Air Force over Los Angeles when things went drastically wrong. Due to an oil leak, one of the propellers reversed its pitch mid-flight, destabilizing the aircraft. Hughes, in a desperate attempt to save himself and the plane, tried to maneuver towards the Los Angeles Country Club for an emergency landing. Unfortunately, he lost control just before reaching the golf course, and instead crashed into a Beverly Hills neighborhood. The crash caused severe damage. Hughes's plane tore through multiple homes, including actress Rosemary DeCamp's house. In the chaos, the plane slammed through rooftops, barely missing occupants in the home before coming to a fiery stop. Neighbors and military personnel from a nearby base rushed to pull Hughes from the burning wreckage. His injuries were catastrophic. He suffered third-degree burns, a crushed chest, broken ribs, a shattered collarbone, and a collapsed lung. After the crash, Hughes was in a lot of pain, and he turned to painkillers to cope. This only added fuel to the fire, making him even more paranoid and reclusive. By the 1970s, he had fired his staff, locked himself in a hotel room, and was mostly incoherent, mumbling to himself and often surrounded by empty codeine bottles. In the end, Hughes's severe mental health issues isolated him completely, turning him into a tragic figure, far from the once bold pilot and Hollywood big shot he'd been. By the time Howard Hughes passed in 1976 at 70, his life was a shadow of his earlier days as a daring aviator and Hollywood tycoon. In his final years, Hughes lived secluded in various darkened hotel rooms where he reportedly lay naked, unwashed, and almost completely detached from the outside world. His OCD and paranoia had reached such heights that he kept his contact limited to a handful of loyal employees, known as his Mormon Mafia, who provided him with food, managed his basic needs, and enabled his obsessive routines. His life revolved around extreme rituals. He even refused to cut his hair or nails, which grew to extreme lengths, and avoided bathing, convinced of contamination risks from nearly everything around him. Hughes was so frail and malnourished by the time of his demise that he weighed only about 90 pounds. But so far, all of these are what people know about Hughes and his mental issues. But what you don't know is that it's deeper than you think. Little by little, this mental illness extended to his businesses, especially when it came to making timely decisions. Deals could go into limbo for months or even years, as he wavered, reevaluating minor details or getting stuck on specific rules he'd created for himself. For instance, he'd sometimes instruct employees to only use certain types of memo paper or follow strange filing procedures, adding layers of delay. His fear of germs meant he'd avoid in-person meetings, so crucial decisions either happened over the phone in frustratingly indirect ways or just didn't happen at all. A classic example? Hughes Aircraft. Despite being a pioneer in aviation technology, Hughes would stall on signing off on projects or responding to government contracts. Competitors moved ahead, and even his trusted executives struggled to steer the ship without his approval. Financially, his delays and overcomplicated routines bled millions from his empire, as the companies that once thrived under his genius now stagnated under his indecision. As Hughes's mental health deteriorated, his self-care and physical appearance became almost unrecognizable. He stopped cutting his nails, which grew grotesquely long, and let his hair and beard become wild and matted. Hygiene routines fell apart completely. Hughes reportedly avoided bathing and wore the same clothes until they were tattered and stained. His diet suffered too. He consumed mostly sugar-filled foods, refusing anything that didn't meet his strict, often arbitrary preferences. This spiral into physical neglect was a stark symbol of how his mind and body became prisoners to his OCD and depression. In time, Hughes's self-imposed isolation grew worse. At his most reclusive, he spent weeks in darkened rooms, away from daylight and human interaction, consumed by obsessive rituals. This pattern left him physically frail, and his health declined drastically due to severe malnutrition and dehydration. But when this mental illness was studied, the findings were astounding. Psychologist Raymond D. Fowler offered a unique perspective on Howard Hughes, delving deep into the roots of his mental struggles. Fowler, a leading psychologist and former chair of the psychology department at the University of Alabama, was hired to conduct a psychological autopsy on Hughes after his death. After reviewing thousands of pages of Hughes's notes and transcripts of interviews with those close to him, Fowler uncovered the influences that shaped Hughes's mental decline. Hughes grew up constantly surrounded by warnings about illness and contamination. This contributed to his own fixation on cleanliness and germs, behaviors that only intensified over time. Fowler noted that Hughes developed an avoidance personality disorder, making him naturally shy, withdrawn, and more inclined to keep to himself. His social struggles as a child persisted into adulthood, leaving him with few close relationships and a habit of isolating himself, especially in stressful times. Fowler also believed that the series of physical traumas Hughes endured, most notably his near-fatal plane crash in 1946, played a critical role in his mental decline. Fowler suggested that these traumatic events may have caused or worsened brain damage, creating a vicious cycle where physical and emotional pain fed into each other, escalating his obsessive behaviors and fear-driven routines as he aged. But that's not all. Fowler's research went even deeper into Hughes's flings and fleeting relationships. In his 20s, Howard Hughes was famous for dating some of Hollywood's biggest stars, and he seemed to have an endless string of high-profile romances. Yet, despite all his affairs, he never truly let anyone in. Even with his 2 wives, he kept his emotional distance, eventually retreating back into the isolation he had known as a child. Fowler, the psychologist who analyzed Hughes's life, said Hughes's tendency to withdraw and avoid close relationships was rooted in his early years and only grew stronger over time. On top of all this, the plane crash was not the only crash that had an effect on his life. There were other severe accidents that left both physical and mental scars. Within a decade, Hughes faced a series of traumatic events. Once, he accidentally ran over a pedestrian. Another time, he crashed a seaplane off Long Island, experiencing oxygen deprivation due to a faulty mask. Later, he crashed another seaplane, this time killing 2 passengers and leaving himself with a deep head wound. Then there was the car crash where his head hit the windshield so hard he remained disoriented and semi-conscious for days. Even smaller accidents, car mishaps and falls, took a toll, especially on his head and face. Fowler believed these repeated incidents stacked up over the years, both physically and psychologically, worsening Hughes's paranoia, isolation, and obsessive routines. The accumulation of these injuries likely played a role in pushing him further into reclusion and fueling his erratic behavior later on. Now all of his withdrawals and behaviors make sense. Howard Hughes was not a madman. He was simply a victim of circumstance, and he will be missed and remembered for his enduring legacy.